Sandra Bullock pulled into the small gas station at the edge of town, her car humming softly as the engine cooled. The sun was just starting to dip behind the horizon, casting a warm glow over the dusty roads. It had been a long drive, and the quiet solitude of the place was exactly what she needed. She stepped out of her car, stretching her legs as she looked around. The station was practically empty, save for a few scattered cars. As she walked toward the pumps, Sandra noticed a group of bikers leaning against their motorcycles. Their leather jackets glinted in the fading sunlight, and the deep rumble of their engines seemed to fill the air. There were at least 5 of them, and they were clearly not here just to fill up. They eyed Sandra with a mix of curiosity and something darker, making her stomach tighten. Just get your gas and go, Sandra thought to herself. It wasn't unusual for people to stare, but there was something unsettling about the way they were looking at her. Too intense, too predatory. She brushed off the feeling, trying to focus on the task at hand. But as she walked past them toward the pump, one of the bikers, a tall man with a thick beard and a scar running down his face, pushed off his bike and stepped into her path. "Hey, there, sweetheart," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You lost or something? You look like you need some company." Sandra froze for a moment, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Her hand instinctively reached for her phone in her pocket, but the thought of calling for help didn't feel like enough. She forced a smile, hoping to deflect his attention. "I'm just getting some gas," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm fine, thanks." The biker didn't move, his gaze growing more intense. "Are you sure? We've got plenty of time to chat. Maybe you want to ride somewhere?" Sandra's heart started to race. She knew she had to stay calm. She took a deep breath and stepped back, trying to keep the situation from escalating. "I'm really fine," she repeated, her eyes darting around looking for someone to help. But the station was still as empty as it had been when she first pulled in. The biker's grin widened, and it became clear he wasn't about to let her go that easily. "You know, you don't have to be so uptight. We're just trying to have a little fun." Before Sandra could respond, a figure appeared from behind the convenience store, a tall, calm presence that seemed to change the air around him. He was walking slowly but with purpose, his eyes scanning the situation. It was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a simple black jacket and jeans, but there was something about him that instantly drew Sandra's attention. He walked past the group of bikers, his steps steady and confident, never breaking his focus from them. The biker with the scar turned his head toward Keanu, his grin faltering slightly. "What's your problem, man?" the biker called out. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply continued walking toward Sandra, his expression calm but unwavering. It was as if he hadn't even noticed the tension in the air, until now. Sandra's heart began to calm, though she wasn't sure why. There was something about Keanu's presence that made her feel safer. She took another step back, now feeling the sudden, inexplicable pull of something more than just a stranger's protection. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Sandra took another step back, her gaze flickering between the biker and the man who had just arrived. Her mind raced, trying to process the sudden shift in the atmosphere. There was something about Keanu Reeves that felt like an anchor in the chaos, like he had stepped out of another world where danger didn't exist, where things just made sense. The biker, clearly not happy about being interrupted, grunted and adjusted the strap of his leather vest. "You got a problem, man?" he spat, his eyes narrowing at Keanu. Keanu didn't flinch. He took another deliberate step forward, his presence commanding the space without uttering a word. He was close now, too close for comfort, and the air between them felt charged, like an electric current waiting to snap. Sandra's heart raced, not because of Keanu, but because of the biker's rising hostility. She could feel the tension thickening in the air. These weren't just any bikers. These were the kind of men who thought they could take what they wanted without consequence. The man with the scar took another step forward, his body language, now aggressive, and Sandra felt her pulse spike. He was about to do something, and there was no way she could stand there and wait for him to make the first move. "Just walk away," Sandra found herself saying, more out of instinct than logic. She was trying to buy herself time. "I'm fine, you can leave now." But the biker wasn't backing down. His smile, once amused, had now turned into something darker. "What, you think you can just tell me to leave?" he sneered. "This is our stop, sweetheart. You don't own the place." Keanu's eyes never left the bikers, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, something Sandra couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just about being calm anymore, it was about control. The way Keanu moved and spoke, it was clear he was no stranger to confrontation. His voice was soft but firm. "I'm not asking you to leave, I'm telling you," Keanu said, his tone barely above a whisper, but the strength in his voice was undeniable. "You need to walk away before this gets ugly." Sandra watched in awe as the biker hesitated. It was only a brief moment, but in that instant she could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The tension didn't ease, though. It only shifted, like the storm had changed direction but was still coming. The biker's friends began to shift uneasily on their bikes, casting wary glances at one another. It wasn't just Keanu they were concerned about now. It was the fact that Sandra, a woman they'd been toying with, now had someone willing to stand up to them. And that wasn't something they took lightly. "You think you can just walk in here and take control of our business?" Another biker, this one taller and bulkier, growled, his fists tightening around the handlebars of his motorcycle. "You don't know who we are." Sandra's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The bikers were closing in on Keanu, and she was stuck in the middle. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Not yet. Not while Keanu was standing there, like he was prepared to face whatever they threw at him. "You're right," Keanu said, his voice calm and even. "I don't know who you are, but I don't need to. All I need to know is that you're not going to threaten her." The biker with the scar grinned again, stepping closer to Keanu. "You think you can stop us? You think you're the hero in this story?" he mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. Keanu's eyes flicked to Sandra for the briefest of moments, a quiet assurance in his gaze. He wasn't looking at her as a damsel in distress, but as someone he was willing to protect, no matter the cost. Sandra took a small step back, her heart hammering in her chest, but the sound of Keanu's voice made her feel a flicker of calm. She realized in that moment that he wasn't just standing there for her. He was standing there for himself, for the principle that no one, not even a group of intimidating bikers, should have the power to bully or threaten someone else. "Leave," Keanu said again, this time louder, more forceful, "or I'll make you." The biker with the scar's grin faltered. He exchanged a look with the others, and for a split second, Sandra thought this might actually end without further confrontation. Then, with a flash of movement, the situation escalated. The scarred biker lunged, throwing a punch toward Keanu's face. The rest of the group followed his lead, the scene shifting from tense standoff to full-blown chaos in an instant. Sandra gasped as she watched Keanu duck effortlessly under the punch, his body moving with a fluid grace she hadn't expected. Without missing a beat, he countered, pushing the biker back with a firm but controlled shove. It wasn't violence, at least not in the way Sandra expected, but rather a display of skill and strength that left the biker stumbling. Before the others could react, Keanu was already back on his feet, standing tall and unshaken. The bikers paused, sizing him up, clearly realizing that this wasn't going to be as easy as they'd thought. "Back off," Keanu said again, his voice now firm, almost warning them. "I don't want this to get out of hand." But the scarred biker wasn't done. He spat on the ground and took a step forward, snarling. "You're messing with the wrong people, buddy." Sandra's heart pounded as the tension ratcheted up again. The situation wasn't over. It was far from over. And now, more than ever, Sandra knew she wasn't alone, but she also wasn't sure how much longer Keanu's calm demeanor would be enough to keep the bikers at bay. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating almost. Sandra stood frozen, unable to look away from the escalating conflict. Her heart raced, but there was something oddly reassuring about the way Keanu carried himself. He wasn't just defending her. He was showing them that this wasn't something they could walk away from. This wasn't a fight. It was a test of willpower, a battle of who would fold first. The scarred biker took another step forward, his fists clenched, ready to strike again. But Keanu's eyes never left him. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. Sandra couldn't help but notice how effortlessly Keanu moved, like someone who had faced down situations like this 100 times before. Keanu's voice, calm and measured, broke the silence. "This doesn't need to go any further. You want to fight? Fine. But not here. Not now." For a moment, the group of bikers hesitated. There was something in Keanu's voice, something that made them pause. But then the larger biker, the one who had been silent up until now, let out a low growl and took a step forward. "You think you're tough, huh? You think you can just tell us what to do?" Keanu didn't move. His stance was strong, but relaxed, like he had all the time in the world. His eyes flicked to Sandra briefly, a silent reassurance that she was safe for the moment. But the bikers were closing in, and she could see the tension building up in Keanu's shoulders. The moment was coming, and she could feel the impending explosion in her bones. The scarred biker reached out, grabbing Keanu by the arm. The sudden motion was enough to break the silence, and in a flash, everything erupted. Keanu was fast. Too fast. In one swift motion, he twisted his arm out of the biker's grasp, his other hand pushing the man back with a force that left the biker stumbling. But he didn't stop there. Keanu followed up with a perfectly timed kick, aimed at the biker's chest, sending him crashing into the pump with a loud thud. Gasoline splashed around the ground, but it didn't ignite. The air, however, was now filled with the sharp scent of danger. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as she watched the scene unfold. The bikers were not backing down. In fact, it was clear that they were getting angrier. The scarred biker slowly rose to his feet, rage burning in his eyes. His hand went to his belt, and Sandra's heart skipped a beat when she saw the gleam of a knife being drawn. "Get him," he shouted, turning to the others. Without hesitation, the remaining bikers surged forward, but Keanu was already moving again. This wasn't the first time he'd been in a fight, Sandra realized. Each movement was fluid, practiced, like a well-choreographed dance. He didn't just fight, he controlled the fight. Keanu ducked under a wild swing from one of the bikers, then countered with a quick jab to the man's midsection, forcing him to stagger backward. The biker let out a sharp gasp, clutching his stomach. But the other two weren't about to let up. They lunged together, hoping to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. Sandra's mind raced, unable to make sense of everything happening so quickly. She felt like she was in the middle of a movie, watching a scene unfold in front of her that didn't quite seem real. But as the bikers came closer, her fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She couldn't stand there and do nothing. She had to help. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a metal gas nozzle, and swung it at the closest biker's arm. The blow was not particularly powerful, but it caught him off guard. He yelped in surprise, momentarily, distracted, giving Keanu the opening he needed. With a series of rapid, calculated moves, Keanu disarmed the first biker, knocking the knife from his hand, and then twisted the man's arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The remaining bikers hesitated for just a second, trying to figure out how they could still win this fight. "Enough," Keanu said, his voice ringing with authority. He wasn't shouting, he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the bikers reconsider their next move. Sandra's heart was pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening. She just swung a gas nozzle at someone, but Keanu had done more than defend her. He'd taken control of the situation. He was calm, focused, like nothing could shake him. The biker, who had been knocked to the ground, struggled to get up, but Keanu stepped toward him, raising a hand. "You're done," he said simply, his eyes sharp. The biker, seeing the raw power and confidence in Keanu's gaze, didn't argue. He dropped, his shoulders in defeat, standing up and backing away slowly. The rest of the group followed suit. They didn't even speak. One by one, the bikers got back on their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life as they peeled away from the gas station, leaving behind only the echo of their tires skidding across the pavement. Sandra exhaled, finally, realizing she had been holding her breath. She looked at Keanu, her heart still racing, but now for a different reason. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She couldn't believe how close she had been to something much worse. Keanu turned to her, his face still calm, but there was a subtle hint of relief in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice softer now that the danger had passed. Sandra nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yeah, I think so." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound now was the hum of the gas station and the fading roar of the bikers' engines. But in that silence, Sandra realized that her world had shifted. She had just been saved. By a stranger. By someone who had no reason to step in and defend her, yet had chosen to anyway. And she couldn't help but feel that this encounter wasn't just a fluke. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, but Sandra's heart still pounded in her chest. She couldn't shake the images of the bikers closing in on her, the sound of their engines vibrating through her body. She glanced at Keanu, who was still standing in front of her, his posture relaxed, as if nothing had happened. But she knew that wasn't true. Something had happened. Something had shifted. For a moment they just stood there, the weight of what had just occurred hanging in the air between them. Sandra opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. She was still processing the chaos, still trying to understand what had just happened. Keanu broke the silence first, turning to her with a slight smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "You're safe now, they're gone." Sandra nodded, her throat tight. "I don't even know what to say. Thank you. I didn't expect that. You handled it so calmly." Keanu shrugged, his gaze flickering to the empty parking lot where the bikers had been moments ago. "It's nothing. I've dealt with situations like that before." His voice was quiet, almost distant, like he was more focused on the bigger picture than on her gratitude. Sandra studied him closely. There was something about him that felt different. He wasn't the typical hero type. He didn't wear a cape or make grand speeches. He was just there, calm, collected, doing what needed to be done without drawing attention to himself. "Still," Sandra said, her voice firmer this time, "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. I probably wouldn't be standing here." Keanu's eyes softened for a brief second before he nodded. "I'm glad I was here. But I wasn't the only one who stepped in. You did too. You grabbed the nozzle, distracted them." Sandra blinked. She hadn't realized how much she'd reacted in the heat of the moment. It was like her body had taken control before her mind had a chance to register what was happening. "I guess I didn't really think about it. It just happened." Keanu's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if trying to read her. Finally, he gave a small nod, as if satisfied with something he hadn't voiced. "Sometimes, in situations like that, you don't have the luxury of thinking. It's about instinct, and you did what you had to do." Sandra smiled weakly, grateful for his understanding. The weight of the situation was still heavy on her shoulders, but Keanu's calmness had a strange way of making everything feel a little bit lighter. As she took another breath, the faint sound of another car engine approaching caught her attention. She looked up, instinctively stepping back toward the safety of the gas pump, but Keanu's hand on her arm stopped her. "Relax," he said, his tone more reassuring than before. "It's just someone else pulling in." Sandra glanced at him, unsure, but when she looked back at the approaching vehicle, her stomach dropped. It was another motorcycle, but this time it wasn't a group of bikers. It was just one man, alone. A sleek black Harley-Davidson pulled into the lot with a smooth purr, the rider's face hidden by the dark visor of his helmet. Sandra's heart rate picked up again. She couldn't explain why, but something about this new arrival made her uneasy. The man didn't get off the bike immediately. So instead, he simply idled at the pump, watching her. Keanu's expression didn't change, but Sandra noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Without another word, Keanu began walking toward the man on the motorcycle. Sandra felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. She wanted to follow to make sure things didn't escalate again, but she stayed rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do. The man on the bike finally dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood tall, wearing a long black coat that seemed to flow around him like a shadow. As he removed his helmet, Sandra's stomach lurched. It was another face she recognized, another star from her past, someone who hadn't been in the spotlight for years, yet still carried an aura of mystery and danger. A name came to mind, James Marlowe. Sandra had heard stories about James Marlowe. He was known for being elusive, mysterious, and someone whose name had been tied to a series of shady dealings over the years. But what was he doing here at a random gas station in the middle of nowhere? Keanu stopped a few feet away from James, his expression unreadable. James stared at him for a moment, sizing him up, before his lips curled into a small, amused smile. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, his voice smooth, almost calculating. Sandra's pulse quickened. She didn't know who this man was, but the way Keanu stood there, calm and unflinching, made it clear that there was history here, history that neither of them was ready to discuss. "Keanu," James said again, the smile never leaving his face. "Always in the middle of things, aren't you?" Keanu didn't respond immediately, but the air between them grew thick with an unspoken tension. Sandra could feel the shift in the atmosphere, as if this moment was the calm before a storm. "So," James continued, his tone shifting from playful to cold, "what are you doing here exactly? Shouldn't you be off somewhere saving someone else?" Keanu's response was simple. "I could ask you the same thing." The two men stood there, eyes locked, as if daring the other to make the first move. Sandra shifted uneasily, unsure of where this conversation was headed. She didn't like the way James's eyes kept flicking toward her, as if calculating something in his mind. It felt wrong. It felt dangerous. The silence between Keanu and James was almost suffocating. Sandra stood there trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but her mind was swirling in confusion. James Marlowe, the name that had always lingered in the back of her mind, was now standing in front of her, and Keanu, the man who had just saved her life, was locking eyes with him in a way that made it clear this was no coincidence. Sandra's stomach twisted as James's eyes slid from Keanu to her, his gaze intense and calculating. He tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down her spine. "I see you've made a new friend, Sandra," he said softly, almost too casually. Keanu's stance never faltered, his shoulders squared, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw that Sandra noticed. His calmness now seemed more like restraint, like a dam waiting to burst. "You know her?" Keanu asked, his voice low but sharp. James smirked, but there was something in his expression that didn't sit right. "Let's just say we have a history. But I'm sure you already knew that, didn't you?" Sandra's heart dropped. History? What kind of history could Keanu have with this man? And why was it making the air between them feel so heavy? Keanu didn't answer, but Sandra could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Something was off, something she couldn't yet understand. It was like a piece of the puzzle had been dropped into place, but she couldn't quite figure out where it fit. James continued, his voice smooth, almost soothing in its cadence. "I didn't think I'd find you here, Keanu. Then again, I never think much of anything anymore." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "But maybe it's fate. You and I, we never seem to be able to stay away from each other." Sandra felt a knot tighten in her chest. Her thoughts were racing. Was this man threatening them? Was there something between him and Keanu that had never been resolved? Keanu's eyes darkened slightly, and Sandra could see the muscle in his jaw twitching. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't giving James the satisfaction of a heated response either. He was calm, too calm. It was like he was holding something back, something dangerous. "I'm not here for you, James," Keanu said, his voice flat but tinged with a subtle warning. "I'm here for her. So if you're going to make trouble, make it quick." James didn't seem fazed. In fact, he looked more entertained than anything. He crossed his arms, his gaze flicking from Keanu to Sandra, then back again. "You always were the hero, weren't you, Keanu? The knight in shining armor coming to the rescue, but you never really know the whole story, do you?" Sandra took a step forward, her pulse racing. "What do you mean by that?" Her voice came out more forcefully than she intended, but she couldn't help it. She needed answers, needed to understand what had brought them all here, what had tied her to these two men in the first place. James's smile widened, and he took a slow step, closer to her, lowering his voice as though sharing some kind of secret. "I mean that you're in over your head, sweetheart. You've stepped into something far darker than you realize." Keanu's body language shifted, his hand moving instinctively to the inside of his jacket. where Sandra knew he kept something, hidden, something that had been the source of his unshakable confidence. But he didn't draw it. Instead, he locked eyes with James again, his jaw clenched tightly. "You don't know her," Keanu said softly, almost as a warning to James. "And you don't want to." Sandra felt a wave of unease wash over her as she looked at Keanu. The weight of his words, the finality in his tone, sent a ripple of anxiety through her. It was clear that whatever this was, whatever history existed between Keanu and James, was something Sandra had no real understanding of. James let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, I know enough." His voice dropped, becoming more menacing. "Keanu, you always were a hero, but heroes don't get to walk away from the past, not when it's chasing them." Sandra's mind spun, trying to piece together the puzzle. She had thought her day was strange when the bikers showed up, but this was different. This was personal. It felt like something far more dangerous was unfolding right before her eyes. She turned to Keanu, her heart heavy with the weight of the situation. "Keanu," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "what's going on? What is it between you two?" For the first time since they'd met, Keanu seemed to hesitate. His eyes met hers, and there was something in them, a mixture of pain and regret, that made her chest tighten. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his words were laced with a subtle edge of warning. "Some things are better left in the past," he said quietly, though Sandra could hear the tension in his voice. "Trust me, this isn't a fight you want to be a part of." But it was too late. Sandra already felt like she was in the middle of it. James's laughter broke the heavy silence. "Oh, but it's already begun, hasn't it?" he said with a wicked gleam in his eye. "And I think you'll find that you're already much deeper into it than you realize." The words hit Sandra like a slap. She couldn't breathe, couldn't make sense of the situation. The world felt like it was spinning faster and faster, and all she could do was watch as Keanu and James exchanged a tense, knowing glance. It was clear now. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was something much darker, much more complicated, and Sandra was caught in the middle of it. Sandra stood there, her breath shallow, as the weight of the situation pressed down on her chest. Keanu was on one side, as calm and collected as ever, but there was a tension in his stance that betrayed his inner turmoil. James, on the other hand, seemed almost too comfortable, his confidence radiating like a dangerous force in the air. His earlier words echoed in Sandra's mind. "You're already much deeper into it than you realize." What did he mean? And why did she feel like she was caught in the middle of a storm that she couldn't see coming? Keanu's gaze never wavered from James. The two men stood facing each other, their silence speaking volumes more than any words could. Sandra wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but the moment felt fragile, like pushing the wrong button might set off an explosion she wasn't ready for. Finally, Keanu broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "This doesn't have to get worse." James laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down Sandra's spine. "You always did. Think you could talk your way out of things, Keanu. But the truth is, you and I both know where this is headed." He turned his eyes toward Sandra, and for the first time his smile seemed genuine, if not a little too pleased. "I'm not here to make things easy for you, sweetheart." Sandra's heart began to race again. She could feel her instincts screaming at her to get out of this situation, to get away from these two men who were locked in some kind of twisted dance. But she couldn't leave. Not now. Not when she was already too deep into whatever this was. "James," Keanu said, his voice tightening. "I told you, I'm not here for this. I don't want to do this with you." James tilted his head, considering Keanu's words with a mock-serious expression. "Not here for what, Keanu? The game, the deal? You can't walk away from this world. None of us can, and you know that better than anyone." Sandra felt like she was drowning in the tension. She needed to understand. What was Keanu running from? What was this world that James kept mentioning, and why was it so personal? Her thoughts raced, but she couldn't find the right words to ask. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to know the truth anymore. The more she uncovered, the darker the path seemed. James took a step closer to Sandra, his eyes flicking to her once more, the intensity in his gaze sending another shiver through her. "You're in a lot more danger than you think. This isn't—" just about Keanu anymore, it's about you too." Keanu's jaw clenched, and before Sandra could ask anything more, he spoke again, his voice firm. "Don't you dare involve her in this, James." James's eyes sparkled with amusement. "I'm not involving anyone, Keanu. I'm just telling the truth." He paused, his smile growing. "The truth is, you've both been playing a game, but now the stakes are higher." Sandra stepped forward, her eyes darting between the two men, trying to make sense of it all. "What do you mean the stakes are higher?" James glanced at her, his smile fading into something more sinister. "You're not the only one in danger. Here, Sandra, there are people who will come after you, people who are far more dangerous than you can imagine, and Keanu, he's already in too deep to walk away." Keanu's eyes flicked to Sandra briefly, before he returned his gaze to James. "I've been through worse, James. I've walked away from far worse than this." James laughed again, a low, mocking sound. "Oh, I don't doubt that, Keanu. But this time, you're not alone." He turned to Sandra, his expression softening just slightly. "And maybe that's the real problem." Sandra's heart sank. She was not prepared for this. She had never asked for any of it. But here she was, standing in the middle of something, far bigger than herself, something darker, and the realization hit her hard. James was right. She wasn't just a passive observer anymore. She was part of it now. The question was, how could she get out? Keanu turned to her, his face unreadable. "Sandra, you need to leave. Get in your car and go. I'll handle this." She shook her head. "No, I'm not leaving. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not running away anymore." Keanu's eyes softened just for a moment. It was a rare crack in his armor, and Sandra saw it for what it was, genuine concern. He wanted to protect her, but the weight of his past was pulling him in a different direction. "This isn't something you can just walk away from, Sandra," Keanu said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "It's not that simple." Sandra stood tall, determination building in her chest. She didn't know what had happened between him and James, but she wasn't going to let them decide her fate for her. "Not this time. I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, her voice steady. Keanu's gaze held hers for a long moment, and Sandra could see the battle in his eyes. He wanted to argue, to keep her safe by pushing her away, but he couldn't do it. Not anymore. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the situation had become too much to carry alone. James, watching the exchange between them, seemed almost entertained by the back and forth. "Well, this is interesting," he mused. "The girls got spirit, I like that." Keanu's expression hardened again, his jaw set in a way that told Sandra he was preparing for what was coming next. "This isn't a game, James," he said sharply. James's smile returned, though it was colder than before. "No, this is real, and we're all in it now." Sandra didn't know what that meant, but one thing was for sure. She was not the same person who had walked into that gas station hours ago. Something had shifted, and now there was no going back. The air crackled with tension as the standoff between Keanu, James, and Sandra lingered in that strange space between threat and anticipation. Sandra could feel her pulse quicken, her breath shallow as she stood there, unwilling to back down. She had no idea what was really happening, but she knew she couldn't stand idly by any longer. Something had shifted in her, and she wasn't about to let it go. James smirked, as if savoring the chaos he had stirred. "You still don't get it, do you, Sandra? This isn't just some game. You think you're in control because you've got Keanu here protecting you, but trust me, sweetheart, you're just another pawn in this mess." Sandra felt a cold wave of unease wash over her. He was right about one thing. She didn't understand. But she wasn't going to let him see that fear. "If you think I'm just going to let you manipulate me like that, you're wrong," she shot back, surprising herself with the force in her voice. Keanu's eyes flicked to her in warning, but there was no time to waste on caution anymore. She had to stand her ground, and he knew it. Keanu shifted slightly, taking a step toward James, his body tense with barely contained energy. Sandra could see the raw anger in his eyes, the kind of anger that spoke of long-buried emotions, of battles fought and lost. "I told you, James." "Stay away from her," Keanu said, his voice now low and controlled. But there was a bite to it that made Sandra's stomach tighten. James raised an eyebrow, almost mockingly. You think you can control this, Keanu? You think you're the one in charge here? He laughed darkly, then turned his eyes back to Sandra. She's in too deep now, buddy. She's already made her choice. There's no walking away from this anymore. Keanu's hand clenched at his side, but his face remained stone cold. Don't push me, he warned, a growl edging into his voice. The sudden tension in the air felt like a trap, and Sandra could sense it. Everything was building to a head, but she wasn't ready to just sit back and let things happen around her anymore. Not when her life, her future, was on the line. Keanu, she said, her voice steady but urgent. What's going on? Who is this guy to you? Why does he keep talking like we're already doomed? Keanu's eyes shifted to hers, a brief flicker of something unreadable passing through them. James isn't just some random guy, he said slowly, as if the words were heavy on his tongue. He's someone from my past, a past I thought I could leave behind. His gaze hardened. But it seems it never really lets go. Sandra could feel the weight of those words settle over her like a fog. The past, she thought. So much of Keanu's quiet intensity, his elusive nature, had come from this mysterious past. But she needed to understand it all now. If she was going to survive, if she was going to make it out of this nightmare, she needed the full picture. Then why don't you just walk away? Sandra asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. If you can't control him, if this is really that dangerous, why didn't you just leave? Why get involved with me? Keanu's eyes softened for a brief moment, but the hardness returned quickly. You wouldn't understand. I didn't have a choice, James smirked. Of course he didn't, he never does. Sandra felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a personal conflict. This was a battle that had been brewing for years, and now it was her turn to step in. I don't care about your history or your unfinished business, James, she said, her voice firm. But what I do care about is getting out of here alive, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that happens. Keanu turned to look at her, a mix of surprise and admiration flashing across his face. She had always been tougher than she gave herself credit for, but this was different. She wasn't just trying to stand her ground, she was willing to fight. Before Keanu could respond, a noise in the distance shattered the fragile moment of quiet. That had fallen over them. Tires screeched to a halt, and a dark van appeared at the end of the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the gloom of the evening. James's expression shifted immediately, the smirk fading into something darker. Looks like the cavalry's arrived, he muttered, his tone now cold and calculating. Sandra's stomach dropped. She didn't have to ask who was inside that van. She could feel it in her bones. The danger was closing in fast, and she had no idea how to stop it. Keanu turned to her quickly, his voice urgent. We need to go, now. But it was already too late. The doors of the van slammed open and men in dark clothing spilled out, surrounding them in seconds. They were armed. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as one of them stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area, taking in the situation in a heartbeat. James stepped forward, his posture relaxed, almost as if he were greeting old friends. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, his voice dripping with mock warmth, I see you've come to join the party. The men didn't speak. They just stood there, their hands resting casually on the guns at their hips. Sandra could feel the air thicken with menace. There was no escape now. Keanu's jaw tightened and he stepped closer to Sandra, his body a shield between her and the group of men. You don't want this fight, James, he said quietly. Not here. Not now. James tilted his head, considering the offer, but his smile never wavered. Oh, I think we've crossed that line already, Keanu, and with that the storm finally broke. The first man lunged forward, his hand reaching for the weapon at his waist. Keanu was faster, grabbing the man's arm in a brutal twist, disarming him in seconds. The others moved in immediately, but Keanu was already in motion, his movements precise, controlled, like a dancer in the chaos of battle. Sandra's heart raced as she watched Keanu fight, his strength and skill in each movement taking her breath away. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. She wasn't trained for this kind of thing. But she wasn't going to just stand by and watch either. She grabbed a nearby metal pipe, her fingers shaking as she wrapped them around the cold steel. She didn't know what she was doing, but she wasn't going to let Keanu fight alone. The Kika fight erupted in a blur of motion, gunshots ringing out in the night air. Sandra swung the pipe, striking one of the attackers across the back. But it only slowed him down for a moment. Everything happened so fast, Keanu was already surrounded, his back pressed against Sandra's as he fought with everything he had. She could feel the danger pressing in from every side, but she wasn't giving up. Not now. As the chaos raged on, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking control of the fight, and Sandra was ready to fight back. The fight raged on with brutal intensity, the sound of fists connecting with flesh and the sharp crack of gunfire filling the night air. Sandra's heart was racing in her chest, her every muscle tense as she struggled to keep up with the chaos unfolding around her. Keanu was a blur of motion, his body moving fluidly, instinctively as he took down one attacker after another. The men were relentless, but Keanu's resolve was unshakable. Sandra swung the metal pipe again, this time catching one of the attackers squarely in the ribs. He staggered back, cursing under his breath, but it wasn't enough to stop him. One of the men advanced toward her, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. She could see the weapon at his waist, a gun. She was out of her league, but she wasn't about to go down without a fight. Keanu, noticing her struggle, spun around in a blur of motion, knocking the gun from the man's hand and sending him crashing to the ground. "Stay close," he growled, his voice low and urgent, his eyes scanning the area for more threats. His hand found hers, pulling her close, and for a moment there was a brief flash of something, an understanding, a bond forged in the chaos of the night. Sandra didn't have time to process it. They were still in the thick of it, and there was no time to waste on feelings or words. The danger was all around them, and she needed to focus. "Where's James?" she asked through clenched teeth, her voice barely audible over the noise of the fight. Keanu's eyes flicked around, searching for the elusive figure. "He's here somewhere. He won't back down that easily." Just as he spoke, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared to life in the distance. It wasn't just any engine. It was unmistakable. It was James. Sandra's stomach twisted in dread. James had been watching this all unfold from the sidelines, playing a dangerous game, but now it seemed like he was ready to step in and finish it. She looked over at Keanu, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to stop him. He's going to make this worse," she said urgently. Keanu nodded, his jaw set. "We don't have much time." Without another word, Keanu darted toward the sound of the motorcycle, pulling Sandra along with him. The moment they stepped out of the immediate chaos of the fight, the air felt different, colder, heavier. They were nearing the edge of the gas station parking lot, where the dim glow of the streetlights barely cut through the darkness. And there he was, James. He stood by his motorcycle, his leather jacket glistening under the harsh light, his expression calm, almost amused. He didn't look like someone who had just orchestrated an ambush. He looked like he had it all under control, like he was playing a game with pieces that only he understood. Keanu stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. "This ends tonight, James." James smirked, his hands casually resting on the handlebars of his motorcycle, as if they were having a casual conversation instead of standing on the brink of violence. "Does it, Keanu? Does it really?" Sandra couldn't take her eyes off James. There was something chilling about his calm demeanor in the face of everything that had just happened. The men he'd sent to attack them, his followers, were lying incapacitated on the ground. And yet, here he stood, unscathed, as if nothing had happened. "Enough games," Sandra said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You've put everyone in danger, including me. What is it you want?" James's gaze shifted to her, his smirk widening. "What I want? Oh, it's simple, really. I want to win." He paused, his eyes flicking between Sandra and Keanu, assessing them both. "And you two, you've already chosen sides. Whether you like it or not, you're in this now. You're part of the plan." Sandra felt her blood run cold. "What plan?" Keanu stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "There is no plan, James. You've been playing with fire, and now it's burning you." James' expression hardened. For a split second, the mask of amusement slipping just slightly. "You're wrong, Keanu," he said quietly. "The fire is only just beginning." Before Sandra could respond, James reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device. It was a remote. The smirk returned to his face, only now it was laced with menace. Keanu's eyes widened, and Sandra's heart skipped a beat. "No," she breathed. James clicked the button. A loud, distant rumble shook the ground beneath them, followed by the unmistakable sound of an explosion. Sandra's head whipped around, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. The gas station across the street was now ablaze, flames reaching toward the night sky. The light from the fire painted everything in an eerie orange glow. "Did you think this was over?" James' voice was low, almost purring with satisfaction. That explosion was just the beginning. Keanu's face twisted in rage, but there was something else in his eyes. Fear. "We have to stop him now," he said, his voice a low growl. Sandra felt the adrenaline surge through her. This was it. The real fight wasn't just about surviving. It was about taking down someone who seemed to be untouchable, someone who had the power to destroy everything. James smiled at them, stepping back onto his motorcycle. "It's too late, Keanu, too late for all of you." But Sandra wasn't going to let him get away. "Not after everything. We're not done yet," she said through gritted teeth. Keanu didn't wait for another moment. Without warning, he lunged forward, a blur of motion that took Sandra by surprise. She had no time to react as Keanu and James collided in a brutal fight, fists, elbows, and bodies crashing into one another. The world around them seemed to disappear as the two men fought with everything they had. Sandra knew this wasn't just a physical battle. This was personal. This was years of history, pain, and betrayal boiling over into violence, but she wasn't going to let them destroy everything. Not now. Taking a deep breath, she reached down and grabbed a fallen tire iron, her grip tight, around the cold metal. It was time to make her own mark on this fight. No more running, no more hiding. She wasn't just a pawn anymore. She was a player. With one final push, she charged at the two men.